Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Farm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Seth Stern, who is a legal journalist and an editor at Bloomberg. And we'll be discussing his brand new book titled Speaking Yiddish to Chickens, Holocaust Survivors on South Jersey Poultry Farms. So, Holocaust survivors, Jewish people raising chickens and eggs. And this is mainly in Vineland, and that area, so real South Jersey, and we'll get more into that. So, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I should start off by saying I am no expert in chickens. I will not try to present myself as a poultry expert. So I should say that at the outset. I'm a legal journalist. That's what I do. So this is entirely different from my day job, which is focused on American law with a particular focus on the U.S. Supreme Court.
So how did you get interested in this, in chickens, and especially Holocaust survivors and their poultry farms?
This dates back actually to when I was in law school, my first semester. I was walking to class every day, listening on a Walkman, to date myself, to a Books on Tape of Tuesdays with Morrie, which is a book about a journalist who interviews his professor, and it gave me an idea. I should talk to my grandmother about her experience as a Holocaust survivor. She was 80 years old at the time. And so when I went home for winter break to study for finals, each day during lunch, I started talking to her about a different part of her life, growing up in Lublin, Poland, her experiences in the ghetto there and hiding in the forests nearby. And then after the war, coming to the US and settling on the poultry farm. And I started doing research. I went to Poland, to the Germany, where she was in a displaced persons camp. But the part of the story about her life story that fascinated me the most was how they wound up on a chicken farm. The idea, how did this community of survivors like her, with little or no experience as farmers, wind up raising chickens in South Jersey? So that's sort of what became the focus of my research.
So, but as you say, this was a while ago, and then, finish law school, you become a legal journalist. How did you, I'm going to write a book about this?
I think that I've been working on it on and off for, as I said, close to 25 years. Other things got in the way. I wrote another book. I co-authored a biography of a Supreme Court Justice, William Brennan, who also happened to be from New Jersey. So that's sort of become my specialty on the side, is New Jersey history. But I've spent a lot of time doing research, interviewing my grandmother and my mother, and then broadening it out to archival research and looking at oral histories and doing sort of journalistic interviews of other people. So it's taken quite a bit of time, but I thought it would be an interesting book. It's a little known and fascinating chapter in American Jewish history. I think it's part of a larger story that a lot of people don't know about Jewish American agricultural settlement. Where they lived in the Vineland, New Jersey area was really a unique place in rural America at the time in terms of a thriving Jewish community that was growing after World War II. And I thought it would be interesting to try to tell this story of their adjustment. I think most people picture survivors as urban dwellers, that they settled in cities. And in fact, this was a different kind of adjustment, adjusting to rural life and adjusting to all they had went through, to learn how to become chicken farmers, how they built their own community institutions. They had a landsman, landsmanship. They built their own Stieblech in Vineland, and they sort of embraced and built a Yiddish culture there. So I thought all of those elements could make for an interesting book.
So let's start off, I think, let's first talk about Vineland, where that is, and just a little bit about the community, and then we can start, with your grandparents. I think the book starts that way, but I first want to just to place, in context the listeners, where is, as we said, the book is based on Vineland. It's interesting. I'm recording this from Lakewood, the Lakewood area, which, as is mentioned a number of times in the book, and we can talk about this a little bit later, even though it's not the focus of the book. There was also a poultry, Jews and poultry community raising chickens and eggs and that type of thing, but well, not raising eggs, but eggs for the chickens. But Vineland, where is Vineland, and just the not only where it is and how did just the general poultry industry there, even aside from the Holocaust survivors?
Sure. Vineland is roughly halfway between Philadelphia and Atlantic City, so we're talking far southern New Jersey. I mean, I could tell you a little bit about just the town. This was a town that by the end of World War II was about 100 years old, a city of roughly 30,000 people, geographically quite large, but very much rural in character. So even though you could take a bus, and people did in that era and commute to Philadelphia, it was very much a rural town, but also a unique combination of farms and factories as laid out by its founder. It had these straight street grids, very much almost a planned community, and a lot of factories. It had glass factories and food processing. Progresso soup was for many years made there. You had Italian American truck farmers who grew vegetables and fruit, and then you had the Jewish farmers who tended to gravitate towards chicken farming. But it very much had a rural, small town character in the 1950s.
So I just want to touch on something you just said. Talk about your legal background for those who know about land use. It's like Levittown. I guess it was like a planned kind of land use community, right?
It was sort of a precursor in that it was laid out in a grid, and the founder had a very specific notion of how people would plant even trees, and yeah, so it had a sort of almost pre-suburban planned community feel to it.
Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, let's jump back. Let's talk about your grandparents. You mentioned your grandmother a bunch, and they're kind of like the main characters of the book, even though it is kind of a broad history of the area and of these Holocaust survivors in the area. It also there are characters, and it's interesting in that regard. And your grandparents are. So, what is your grandparents' basic story and background?
My grandparents, as I mentioned, my grandparents were from Lublin, Poland. They met there as teenagers. They married while in the ghetto. They were able to escape thanks to the German the German manager who had taken over my grandfather's factory, and they escaped to the woods where they hid for nearly 2 years. After liberation, they came back to Lublin, and then, like many of the Polish Jewish survivors, they didn't feel safe in Poland. They went to the American occupied American occupation zone in Germany, to a displaced persons camp, and then they were able to come to the U.S. in early 1947. They spent a few months in New York that were frustrating in terms of finding work and just finding a place to live with a post-war housing shortage. They heard about the idea of getting a farm from the Jewish Agricultural Society, and they joined their friends and purchased a farm jointly with my grandmother's childhood friend. And for several years, they lived jointly on this farm, and they raised their daughters, who were born just weeks apart, essentially as twins, functioning as a single household.
Okay, so there's a bunch to unpack over there. First of all, your grandparents' name were Branya and Nachum Green. Was that correct?
Yeah, Branya, Nuchum, and the Americanized would be Betty or Bertha and Nathan. But with friends, it was Branya and Nuchum, or he had Roman was his sort of wartime nickname, and so that's what they knew him as.
So you mentioned, and you detail this in the book much more in depth, and we'll discuss here how it was hard for them coming over, being in New York. Maybe they had relatives, didn't really have any money, didn't really have a job. I mean, what was that? If you want to just explain a little bit more, what was that like? And that kind of led them and other survivors like them to Vineland, to chicken farming.
This was the trajectory was similar, that these survivors came over. They didn't have much. Most of them, I don't want to say none of them, but most of them didn't have much money or education. The war had interrupted their educations. So they came over. Their job prospects weren't great. It was going to be sort of low wage labor. And in my grandparents' case, they had more distant relatives, but they didn't have any close relatives. Their close family had all been killed during the war, so they didn't really feel like they had anyone. And they found out about farming and this notion. It appealed on many levels. It appealed. The title of the book, Speaking Yiddish to Chickens, a lot in oral history interviews, the survivors would joke the chickens didn't care if you spoke Yiddish to them. They didn't know English well, certainly when they arrived. And the chickens didn't care. That was a joke and not a joke. They wanted a job where their language deficiencies weren't necessarily going to be an issue. They were the idea of being their own boss was very appealing after being in confinement or captivity. The idea of a quiet rural life was appealing to a lot of them after what they'd been through. So on many levels, farming was a very appealing option.
So you mentioned the Jewish Agricultural Society. Who were they, and what role did they play, especially in getting them to go to chicken farms, these survivors, and in
The,
Vineland?
the Jewish Agricultural Society was an entity that was founded or funded by Baron de Hirsch, who was a German-born financier dating back to the 19th century. And this speaks to the larger story of Jewish American agriculture. It was this notion dating back to the 1880s that Jews who were stuck in the Pale of Settlement or elsewhere in Russia, that they would be able to go off and create colonies in America and be sort of beyond the city and free. They had come sort of idealists back to the 1880s. The De Hirsch's philanthropy that became the Jewish Agricultural Society helped the colonies, which didn't really work out very well. They required subsidies, and they continued to help individual families settle on farms throughout the United States, including in all 48 states that were then in existence. There were Jewish farmers in the Great Plains and Kentucky. But chicken farming in particular was sort of a manageable way to settle a family. It didn't require a lot of capital. You could get started relatively quickly. And so you had pockets of Jewish chicken farmers, mainly in the Northeast, sort of the Berkshires and Western Massachusetts, Connecticut, the Catskills, down through central New Jersey communities like Lakewood and Farmingdale, and then southern New Jersey. But the Jewish Agricultural Society continued to help settle Jews on farms with the German Jewish refugees and from Austria too, who arrived in the late 30s and early 40s. They were directed to the Vineland area because farms there were a little less expensive than elsewhere, and they continued to help these refugees that were arriving after the war ended.
So first of all, just you mentioned Maurice de Hirsch, Baron de Hirsch. There's a new book on him by Matthias Lehmann.
Mm-hmm.
Baron, Maurice de Hirsch in the Jewish 19th Century by Stanford. So just wanted to mention that.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in learning more about him. So as you said, so the Agricultural Society kind of pushed him there. What do you say it was pretty, affordable, cheap? I mean, what are we talking about? They didn't really have much money. Were they lent money? What did it kind of cost?
Right. I mean, it was more affordable. It was for people without much in the way of money. Buying a farm in South Jersey was cheaper than Central Jersey or cheaper than the Catskills. That's why so many of the post-war arrivals wound up in the Vineland in South Jersey. Most of them had to take out they borrowed from, as in the case with my family, borrowed from relatives. They took out a mortgage. The Jewish Agricultural Society would provide a second mortgage, sort of serve as a guarantor. But they were in debt. They weren't buying these outright. They had mortgages. And that became a problem later as the chicken farming business sort of imploded for them. But yeah, they were in debt as soon as they arrived on these farms.
So I want to just mention something here that I'm sure we'll get back to. Is you mentioned there that the German Jews, the German and Austrian Jews came earlier, and then the Eastern European Jews come later. So as you mentioned throughout the book, they have kind of a nickname. The Germans are the Yekis, and the Eastern European Jews are the probably going to Grini. How do you pronounce it?
Grina that's my understanding. I mean, I may be mispronouncing it too.
And where'd that come from?
That's part of the story that I'm trying to tell, is sort of the dynamics. There's these interesting intergroup dynamics within this Jewish community. So you first had, as I mentioned, in the 1880s, mostly Russian Jews settled in the area, and their descendants were sort of the established American-born Jews who were in this community and did well in the poultry business and otherwise, and started sending their kids to Ivy League schools. And then come the German Jewish refugees in the 30s and 40s. And these were highly educated lawyers and doctors who wound up coming here with nothing. And they recounted having to turn their opera dresses into what they would tend to the chickens with, and turn the chicken feed bags into shirts because they just had no money in the middle of the Depression. And so they came and they felt and they were known as the Yekis, which was a sort of their reputation for fastidiousness and how they acted. The original colonists, the Russian Jews, would look down on the German Jews, which was sort of the inverse of the classic notion in New York, where the German Jews came first and looked down on the Russian Jews. So there was that dynamic. The German Jews felt they weren't welcomed, and then that same dynamic played out when the post-war refugees arrived, and they didn't feel welcomed by either the German Jews or the original colonists' children and grandchildren. Now, whether that was, I explore whether that was their own, they felt self-conscious, or they really were looked down upon and mistreated, is sort of, I can't answer that question at this point, but that certainly was the perception, that those who had came earlier didn't welcome those who came later.
So, like you said, you do explore this throughout the book, and we can come back to this. But so, was there a lot of friction, or more or less they got along, especially I guess all three groups,
In their memory, in the oral history interviews, or when I spoke with them later, yeah, there was that sense that they were mistreated. For the German Jews, some of them felt like they were lumped together with the Nazis when the war started, and people in Vineland would say, "You're the reason we're at war." For the survivors who came after the war, it was, why do you have a tattoo on your arm? Only prisoners do. Some of it was just not understanding what they had gone through, sort of unintentionally insulting them. Certainly it was certainly the case both with the German Jewish farmers and then the post-war arrivals. They tended to keep them to themselves. And that was true not just in Vineland, but elsewhere in the country. And some of their children described it to me as almost a tribal identity, that they prayed the same way, they spoke the same languages, and they just felt most comfortable amongst themselves.
So let's get back to the start. They end up there. It's just this transition, and I think you explore this in the book. How I don't recall if it was your grandfather or his friend that they were partisan in the war, and some of them worked in factories. They were tailors. They were not farmers, and they end up in America, and then they end up in Jersey, and they're chicken farming. What was that experience like for them?
It was an extraordinary adjustment. As you say, so few of them. Some did have agricultural experience, so I don't want to make it sound like none did, but most of these people, these displaced persons, had grown up in cities, large cities, smaller cities, and it was a tremendous sort of culture shock to move to what they considered this small town. So there was that just sort of culture shock of moving to this place, and then coupled with trying to figure out farming. It was a real challenge. I mean, they didn't know the first thing. In the case of my grandfather and the family that they settled with, they didn't know the first thing about chicken farming. And they were among some of the first settlers, and it very much was sort of trying to figure it out yourself. So a lot of just learning by trial and error. And I can go into, I mean, raising chickens, there's certainly, it's funny now, you hear these stories about egg prices are so high and people want to have chickens in the backyard. It's not easy to raise chickens. It's probably easier to raise a handful than it is to have, say, 3,000, or which was the scale of these family farms in the 40s and 50s. But it's not easy. Chickens are frail in terms of their health. They catch all sorts of diseases. They're easily frightened, and they'd smother each other if you weren't careful and you startled them when you came into the coops. They sort of engaged in cannibalism because they weren't used to being cooped up in a coop. So just on many levels, it was a difficult task to learn how to be a chicken farmer and keep them alive. And the comment from one of them that I quote, when you had a good price, when the egg prices were good, the chickens were sick. And then when it just never seemed to work out. So much of it was beyond their control. And that's true in all of agriculture: the weather, the commodities dealers far away who are setting prices. Wild dogs would come and steal hundreds of chickens before you even knew it. And so many of them, given what they had experienced during the war, they wanted that quiet rural life, a sense that they had some control over their lives. And farming doesn't allow you a lot of control, so much as just utterly beyond your control. And it was difficult for many of them.
So if you can give a little bit more of a sense of what that was like, these raising these chickens and having a chicken farm. I know you said you're not an expert in chickens and eggs, but you are more of an expert than probably most people listening to this podcast. So if you can explain what was it like, the coops, the conditions for them, what was that like?
It was hard, and it was all consuming. The chickens, you had to get up early, 5 or 6 a.m. And this is no different than other forms of agriculture. I don't want to make it sound like chicken farming is uniquely difficult, but you got to feed them early. You got to make sure the water pots didn't freeze overnight. You had to, before things were automated, haul hundreds of pounds of sacks of chicken feed into your coops to make sure that they ate. You had to cull the sick ones out so that the others didn't get sick. So you're sort of constantly being vigilant and all day. Uh, so you didn't have a lot of time off, and it was 7 days a week. You couldn't take vacations necessarily. And then there's the whole process of the eggs. You had to a process called candling, check the each egg for blood spots, make sure it was okay, and then you had to weigh them and package them. So it was a lot of work, and both husbands and wives, and oftentimes their children, as they grew up on the farms, had to help out.
And even the winter, I think the coops had heaters, right? And sometimes those could get knocked over, make a fire or whatever.
Well, it wasn't just in the winter when they were chicks. They needed the heat. They weren't able to warm themselves, and so you had these brooder stoves that, as you say, would frequently, not constant. It wasn't just like fire after fire, but yeah, there was the risk that your those would knock over, and they did often cause fires in the coops.
Another aspect as well is the laborers. They hired laborers, and as you go through, I think there's a whole chapter in the book about this where they had issues from these laborers.
The issue was they needed help. That, as I said, the whole family might be engaged in farming, but the kids had to go to school, and oftentimes farm wives or one or the other spouse had to take a job off the farm in local garment factories just because the farm wouldn't support itself. But they needed help on the farm, and they would turn to these employment agencies that would send men from Philadelphia or Baltimore often, who were it was sort of Skid Row men who often had alcohol or other problems, and they just get bus fare and dropped off in Vineland. And the farmers complained that the workers would disappear, that they would rob them, that they weren't reliable. The conditions for the laborers were not very good either in terms of their living conditions. They were often living in the coops or a little room that was built in the coops. They worked long hours. There was sort of a racial dynamic. A lot of the laborers were Black or from Puerto Rico. There was a large migration of Puerto Rican farm workers would come and work on the truck farms, but then they wound up, some of them, working in the chicken farms. So yeah, there was a whole dynamic there, and it was difficult for the farmers to find good help often. And from the perspective of the laborers, they felt that they were exploited and not working under very good conditions. This wasn't unique at all to the survivors, but it was another dimension of their experience there.
So, an average farm, how many chickens were we talking?
At the beginning, and the scale changed very much during the course of the 50s, but initially you're talking about 3,000, 5,000. That was the scale. As time went on, and that was part of the problem they ran into, just the whole scale of agriculture changed as these sort of mega farms developed in the southern part of the United States. And so if you were going to compete, you needed 10,000 chickens, 100,000 chickens, and ultimately 1 million chickens if you were going to be sort of a powerhouse in the poultry industry. So it really changed. But initially, you're talking 3,000 chickens, 1 or 2 coops out back on a farm that might be, say, 10 acres.
Okay, and another key thing is the prices, and I think this has to do with the Korean War. I think that the price, and even before and after, talk about how kind of the prices kind of fluctuate, and that's a big part of this story.
A big part of the story is they picked a terrible time to become chicken farmers because, as I said, the nature of the business changed so much. But initially, things were pretty good. There were price supports during World War II that sort of propped up the price of eggs, and those continued until about 1950. And then, yes, the Korean War suddenly prices went up. The demand for protein for soldiers, for workers went up. And the irony of these victims of war in Europe were suddenly the beneficiaries of an even more distant war in Asia. And so for a while there at the start, things were pretty good. But then by the mid 50s, by 1954, things really went south. The price supports got lifted, but then as the scale, as I said, the scale of agriculture changed, the prices went down, and that continued into the late 50s. And it just became impossible for these farmers to compete. It cost more to produce a dozen eggs than they could get by selling it. The business just didn't make sense. So as time went on, more and more left farming. They may have stayed in the Vineland area, but gone into other businesses, or they left the area altogether.
And a lot of these personal stories you relay in the book with a lot of names, there's a lot more details about these, whether that's, I think, they, as you mentioned, your grandparents' first branch is a joint firm. I think the farm with the Liverants, I think their name is.
Liverants, yes.
And then there was the Lurmans who played, and they eventually became into an oil business. So you do discuss a lot more of that as well. What was it like for the families? I mean, you mentioned the men and the women both in the farm, but I guess I'm going to assume, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that probably at that time mostly was the men. The women, as you mentioned in the book, I'm not going to say they weren't, but were they also, you mentioned this in the book, that's why I asked this also, they were working on garment factories, they're working elsewhere, they were trying to manage the home. What was like the dynamics there?
Women, it varied by family. In some families, the women, the farm wives, were very much engaged in the work of the farm, certainly in the sorting and candling of the eggs. Usually they were very involved. In my grandmother's case, she had to go work at one of the garment factories, as many of the other women did, to help support the family as the farm became less and less viable. So very much so, it was the women were raising the kids. They were engaged in work either on the farm or elsewhere in the garment factories.
Now, what was it like for your mother? What was it like for the kids growing up there as kids on farms?
That's something I try to explore, is that life for I'd also say life for the survivors themselves was different than the life for survivors who settled in cities. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But for the children, yeah, it was. My mom has very fond memories of sort of holding baby chicks in her hands, and sort of both idyllic and dangerous. She has memories of my grandfather had a rifle to shoot or scare away the predators who would come and try to snatch the chickens. So it was a mix, and they would play. There was local, little creeks, and they had tremendous freedom to sort of ride their bikes around. The notion of survivors as overprotective. The reality is they were so busy working on the farm, they couldn't watch their kids all the time. So the kids had tremendous freedom to sort of explore the natural world in a way they wouldn't if they were living, say, in Brooklyn or the Bronx, and maybe they would have gone to a bungalow colony or sleepaway, or a park in New York City was a subway stop or a bus ride away. But for the children of survivors in a place like Vineland, it was that was an integral part of their life. So it was different, and they had more physical space too. That's both the adults and the children. There was just more space. When I said a 10-acre farm, that's a very different experience than survivors who were at least initially living in apartments in Brooklyn or the Bronx or the Queens.
So I do want to explore a little bit more about the survivors themselves and how their experience differed from those who lived in the cities, as you say. But what was the community like? I think we can explore it this way. What was the Jewish community? You mentioned that they had a shtibel, they had shuls, and we can talk about the religious aspect of that. How religious were they? But just in general, first, like overall, how was the Jewish community?
This was such a unique Jewish community, a rural Jewish community. And I should say at the outset that Jews settled all over rural America. And I try to make that clear, whether it was in the Gold Rush, California, or Mississippi. Jews usually came first as peddlers, selling whatever they could carry. And then they had dry goods stores. So you would find Jewish merchants, other Jewish settlers everywhere in rural America. But by 1950, most of those rural Jewish communities had begun to shrivel. Jewish residents, just like other people in rural America, were beginning to move to cities. And in terms of Jewish America, by 1950, the shift had started from city to suburb. And yet in Vineland, those earlier waves of Jewish immigrants that I had mentioned had built up a very robust Jewish community. They had 3 synagogues by the late 40s. They had multiple Zionist organizations. They had a Jewish radio show. There were kosher delis, butchers. It was a very robust Jewish community for a community that size. And then it got sort of even more robust because of the arrival of the post-war refugees, who at first, as I mentioned earlier, did tend to sort of keep to themselves. And so they built up their own, they called it was a Farbond, or they called it the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association. It was a sort of combination mutual aid society and social club. And they had their own activities, and they invited Yiddish artists from New York to come and perform there. And it was a very unique place where they had one survivor had his own Yiddish radio show. They had all of these Yiddish artists coming. Their meetings were often in Yiddish. They had a Yiddish lending library. So there are not a lot of places in rural America in the 1950s where you had this kind of robust and growing Jewish community. They supported a Jewish day school. They built about 5 or 6 shtiblich, often with their own hands, their own labor. They built these within walking distance because many of the survivors wouldn't drive on Shabbat. So it was a very unique place.
So as you say, there were shuls or synagogues and shtiblich. What was the religious life like there?
Well, you had your existing sort of established Jewish synagogues, and some of the survivors joined those. Certainly at the outset, the survivors in general tended to feel most comfortable socializing and praying amongst themselves. So they created they had little congregations in the firehouse or in each other's homes, and then they built a shtibel for the neighborhood where they could walk. The religious observance varied widely, and I think that's true among survivors. And part of the story I try to tell in the book is survivors weren't a monolith in terms of how well they adjusted, how much material success they had, and certainly in terms of their religious observance. My grandparents sort of lost a lot of their faith. They still went to the shtiblich, which was within feet of their home sometimes. But you had others who, I tell the story of some who lost everything. They lost their first families. But after the war, they dug up a Torah. They had hid it in a forest and brought it to the farm where they lived, and they wanted nothing more than to create a little community there. So it just varied tremendously.
So the community, I guess, had all types, you're saying, basically.
Yeah, but I think religious identity was a strong component of this community identity for the survivors. The Passover dances, the Purim parties for the kids, the Hanukkah parties, just every holiday. So it was an important element of their identity, the extent of their religious observance, and whether they did it out of a sense that it was a way of, they'd lost everything. They lost their hometowns. They'd lost their families. Praying as they did as children was a connection to those they had lost. So even for those who had lost faith, the mere act of prayer was a connection to those that they had lost.
Now, this praying, going to shul, was that something, as we discussed earlier, that you had the Russians and the Yankees, the Germans,
yes,
and then the East Europeans, were they all separate? Did they kind of stick to themselves?
You had your established synagogues, some dating back to the early 20th century, and there was some mingling, but for the most part, yeah, the German Jews went to the German Jewish shtibel or shul, and and you had it subdivided. I think there was sort of more of a Hungarian shtibel, and there was so it definitely they gravitated to themselves. That sort of broke down later as the community changed and shrunk. I think that lessened that sense of separation, but certainly at the height, it was very much keeping to yourselves, because you pray. The German Jews had their way of praying, and the Eastern European Jews had their ways.
So the breakdown, how did that occur, and when, what years did that exactly happen, and then what was the gradual decline? What happened then?
Well, I think the peak was really the mid-50s. The arrivals peaked, I think, in the early to mid-50s. There was the peak, and then people started moving away, certainly leaving farming as the business got bad. The community I think the sort of decline of the community saw more of that towards the 70s, perhaps. And it was the same phenomenon you saw elsewhere in rural America. It was just happening in Vineland later because of the influx of the survivors after the war. So the Jewish day school eventually doesn't have enough students to support itself. The same with the delis and the kosher butchers, and you sort of go on and on. The Stiebel one by one would eventually close. So but in terms of the integration or less of the separation, I think as they aged, it became less important, and there were fewer Jewish people in the community, but also generationally. So I try to chronicle how among my among my mother's my mother was born immediately after the war, so there's sort of the first baby boomers, and if you look at what happened in that generation, they were more comfortable becoming friends with the children of the German Jewish refugees, or more comfortable with the American-born Jews, and then amongst them, as they grew older, those who stayed, they joke about intermarriage, which was marrying an American-born Jew or marrying a German Jewish spouse.
Another interesting thing about the schools there, I think you mentioned in the book, is that the public school maybe was one of the first that they introduced like a Holocaust-based curriculum.
Yeah, and I think that's a function of a few people there. One of them, Harry Furman, who is a leader of the South Jersey Holocaust Coalition, I think it's called. So he continues to be he's the son of survivors and was first a teacher and now an attorney in Vineland. And he was very much involved in that course and curriculum, and then first at the local level and then at the state and national level. But there were others. Another was an Italian American teacher who was also very engaged in that, and he recounts how he was a newspaper delivery boy as a child, and he would go to the homes of some of the survivors who looked behind the curtain and seemed very skeptical or weary of him, and he relayed this to his father, who was a truck farmer, vegetable farmer, Italian American, who knew some of the survivors because he would buy their manure to help grow his crops. And he said, look what these people have been through. Can you imagine? You have to be understanding. And it sort of, I think, really stuck with him. And so when he wound up being a teacher, I think that empathy informed why he wound up helping create that course and the curriculum.
And it's a good thing you brought them up. I forgot to mention the Italian community there. I think the mayor was Italian. And what was the relationship between that community?
Yeah, the dynamic, it was very much sort of an Italian. I focus obviously on the Jewish community in Vineland, but it was very much sort of an Italian town. The mayors were in this era Italian. The truck farmers and a lot of the workers in the factories were Italian. Many of the street names in the Italian part of town. The dynamics between Jewish and Italian, it varied so widely, even for a single child. I mean, one son of survivors who grew up there talked about how, every Easter he'd be biking and they'd sort of beat him up a little. And then an hour later, hey, you're going to come play baseball. So it was, I think there was some of that. But you also have some of the the stories of Italian Americans who would help survivors. There's one instance, this Italian American man in Vineland helped drive a survivor's family. They had a child who was ill, and he would drive them just out of the goodness of his heart to the hospital in Philadelphia. And he helped another family, husband and wife. He would drive them to Vineland so they could light yahrzeit candles or get their meat butchered in a kosher way. So it just varied the range of experience. But in general, I mean, one person said it was sort of, they kept to themselves. They grew the vegetables, we had the chickens, that they each lived in their own world to some extent in Vineland.
So once the prices and things kind of imploded, I mentioned the Lermans, you discussed that at length in the book, and how they went into, oil, delivering oil to houses for heating homes, and they left kind of the business. Did a lot of these survivors, once the industry went, imploded, did they stay in Vineland and go into other areas of work, or did they leave Vineland?
Some did. Some stayed and went into other businesses. Some were sort of ancillary to chickens. So you had the one family, the Robs, opened up a butcher, a slaughterhouse for chickens, and it was for a time one of the biggest in America in terms of supplying kosher chickens. Others went into, say, motels or hotels, whether in Vineland or Atlantic City. That required capital. You needed money to be able to do that. Others left entirely, and that was the case with my family. When my mother graduated high school in 1964, they moved to Brooklyn, and so there was an exodus. I mean, people left for other opportunities elsewhere. Well, some stayed and went into other businesses, but certainly by the 60s, for almost everyone, poultry farming was no longer a viable option.
So, on a personal level, what was your family? Why did they leave, and what did they went back to Brooklyn? They went back to the big city. What did they end up doing there?
They were looking for an opportunity. You mentioned the Lerman family. They went into the oil business, and Miles Lerman was one of the founders of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I think it's first for its chair for a time in the 1990s, so sort of a central figure. They enjoyed a lot of success, and I contrast that with my grandfather, who frankly didn't have a lot of success as a businessman in Brooklyn. So sort of went into small businesses. It burned down. This was a time of sort of unrest in that era, and things weren't great. I mean, other farmers fared worse. There were instances they opened in Washington, D.C. or in Los Angeles. They opened a liquor store, a convenience store, and they actually got shot during robberies. So it just varied so widely how much success they had, how much of it was their own initiative, how much was it good or bad luck. I think all of the survivors had good luck in the sense that they survived the war, but just because they had survived the war didn't mean that carried over into good fortune in America.
So, what happened to the Vineland Jewish community in the later decades of the 20th century and then today?
I think it shrank. As I said, that's not unusual in rural or small town America. They're the children of the farmers. Certainly, they went off to school. A lot of them didn't come back, whether they moved to Cherry Hill, New Jersey, or beyond. And that's again what happened elsewhere. Is in rural America, the children just didn't come back after they got an education. So you had some who stayed, but it is a much reduced Jewish community. There's still a Jewish presence. There's still synagogues, but it's nothing on the scale of what it was during this era that I write about.
Do you know how big the community was during the era that you write about?
I think it would be in the neighborhood of 2,000 to 3,000. Now the survivors were about 1,000. Their children were, but if we're talking about the survivors, but overall it was a few thousand more. And again, this was a community of 30,000. And that's Vineland itself. There were many surrounding smaller communities, but it's quite a percentage. I mean, we're talking about maybe 6-7% of the local area were Jewish, which is quite a bit. This definitely was the largest concentration of survivor farmers anywhere in America, settled in South Jersey, the area anchored by Vineland.
So I do want to mention, like I said, living in Lakewood area and recording this from Lakewood, and if people here may be familiar, and those listening to this, that there was poultry farming here as well in Lakewood. And you mentioned this, that mentioned Lakewood farming, the Thames River. What was the contrast a little bit? What was the community there like, the poultry community, as as a kind of general and as opposed to Vineland?
They were larger earlier, so I think you had an earlier influx, as I mentioned, in the Toms River, Lakewood, Farmingdale. A lot of them came in the 20s and 30s. Some of them were more radical in the sense they sort of had socialist or communist sympathies, and so there was more of a radical. I use the term radical not seriously, but in the term of the day, the notion that they had sort of these political views, and whether sort of part of that was what motivated them to seek out farming and communal life. So they had an established community life with a Jewish community center and in some instances like a synagogue inside the community center. Because the farms there were more expensive, that's why some survivors did settle in those areas. Many more wound up in South Jersey. The contrast is a stark one in terms of the decline of the Vineland Jewish community relative to what's happened in the Lakewood area because of the yeshiva and everything that's happened since. So it's quite a stark contrast in trajectory in terms of the size of the Jewish community and what's in terms of Jewish life.
Yeah, I think Lakewood is the sixth or fifth largest city in the state of New Jersey at this point, and it's kind of mainly for the Jewish community. It's kind of been pretty massive and spreading out now as well. So, but getting back to this, so what kind of sources did you use in your research in writing this book?
I started out with the interviews with my grandmother over the course of about 8 years, and then my mother over the course of many more years. And then I expanded out in terms of doing a lot of archival research. The records of the Jewish Agricultural Society are at the Center for Jewish History in New York. It's part of the collection of the American Jewish Historical Society. And I was able to get the case worker records, the caseworker who helped my grandparents when they came to New York. And it was sort of vital in being able to tell the story of their time in New York and how they wound up on a farm. That's also at the Center for Jewish History. From the United Service for New Americans was the agency that helped them. So I did a lot of archival research. I looked at a lot of oral histories that survivors did, whether through the Shoah Foundation, the Steven Spielberg initiative, or the local Jewish Federation in Cumberland County did its own oral histories with a dozen or so of these farmers 25 years ago, which was vital to preserving it. And I really thank them for undertaking that effort. And I spent a lot of time at the Vineland Public Library going through microfilm of the local newspaper, just sort of scroll by scroll. The Jewish Farmer was a publication of the Jewish Agricultural Society in both English and Yiddish. And so I read it was a monthly. And so I read the English. There was also a newspaper called The Poultryman that was published in Vineland about poultry industry news. And so that was an insight into the industry and the state of the business. And then I did sort of the journalist part was I interviewed dozens of other people, whether survivors, their children, or other people in Vineland who were involved in the poultry industry or just part of the Jewish community there. So I did about, 80, 90 interviews with other people as well.
What was that like, the interviews, especially with survivors or with the children of survivors?
People were extraordinarily generous with their time, and it's just sort of remarkable. My mother has left in 1964. It's not like I had deep ties or deep roots in Vineland, but people opened their homes to me and shared their memories, shared their photos that I've been posting on a Facebook page for the book. People are just extraordinarily generous in sharing with me, and that continued during the pandemic. I did a lot of interviews on Zoom or on the phone. And I couldn't have done this without the many, many people who were willing to speak with me.
I have to say, one critique of the book that I have is that there's a picture on the front cover of your family, and I think it's the Deliverance, and but there's no other pictures in the book, and I was looking for pictures.
Yeah, that's a function of the photos are not of a quality that we were able to reproduce in the book. So that's why I've posted dozens of photos on the Facebook page. It's facebook.com/Yiddish to chickens. So if anyone wants to go and look at the photos and some of the other Yiddish material that people might find interesting, I've tried to put it all there. So at least there's an outlet for visuals, even if I couldn't include them in the book itself.
Okay, so just finally, I want to ask you, is this do you view this as more of a Holocaust and survivor story? Is this more of an American story, or is this kind of both?
I think it's both. It's a story of Jewish American farmers and the larger story that people don't know about. I think you tell people Jews are farmers, I think most people they smirk or laugh. It's not so contrary to our view. I think it's different in Israel and the notion of kibbutz and moshavim, but in the United States, we don't identify Jews as farmers. So I'm trying to tell that story. And it is also a survivor story, and to show that survivors weren't a monolith, that they didn't just settle in cities, that they varied in their religious observance, they varied in how much success they had and how they adapted. They all weren't sort of basket cases and ruined by their experiences. They all didn't just sort of manage to magically overcome it. That's what I'm trying to show, is the sort of the mosaic of what life was like for survivors in this place, and perhaps it's a window into their experience more broadly.
Yeah, and there are a lot of personal stories in this book from various survivors and families, and you really do give that mosaic of what life was like there. And I don't know if we did that on the podcast enough. So I do want to mention that for listeners. It reads very nicely. It's kind of, I mentioned this to you before, it's kind of a cross between, even though it is an academic history, it's kind of a cross between an academic and more of a popular read. So it is very readable, and there's a lot of personal stories, and that does come across in the book. So for those interested, and I will link to the book in the shows notes. I think I mentioned, but if I didn't, it's Rutgers University Press. And I would ask you just, if people do read this and they are interested in knowing more about it, and as you mentioned, there were other poultry farming going on in New Jersey. Are there other books or suggested reading that you can mention about the topic?
Yeah, I have a few books here that I would mention. There's a book about the farming community in Farmingdale. The Land Was Theirs by Gertrude Wishnick Dubrovsky. This was published, I think, in the 90s. It's focused largely on the earlier settlers. There's some reference to survivors, but it tells about that community. There's a book about this is Comrades and Chicken Ranchers. It's a story of the poultry farming community in Petaluma, California, which also sort of peaked earlier. And so the focus isn't on the survivors, but they're mentioned a little bit in there. There's a book this was from the 70s by Joseph Brandis, Immigrants to Freedom. It's telling the story of Jewish farming in New Jersey back to the era of the colonies in the 1880s. And the last book I would mention is a book by a University of Kentucky, I think, University of Louisville professor who only recently passed away in the last couple of years, Leishai Weisbach, Jewish Life in Small Town America. And he was this is sort of the foremost history of small town Jewish life. So if people are interested in learning more about that rather than just Jewish farmers, I would recommend that as a starting point.
Okay, well, very interesting, and I will try to link to those in the show's notes as well as to your book. And thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for your interest in the topic.